We're now going to go to Eliza Mondegreen from USA/Canada. She's a graduate student, and she's going to be with Zan, who is going to be also discussing with her. So she's going to be in conversation with Zan. Thank you very much, Zan. And so Eliza is a graduate student researching online trans and detrans communities, and the title of her talk is Down the Rabbit Hole. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Zan and Eliza.
So my first question is, so you're a graduate student and studying this gender identity thing from every angle. So like, what was your impetus? Or do you have research questions or a thesis, or how did you sort of get in? And
so I had worked in the nonprofit sector at a think tank for a number of years and had watched friends of mine and also just the work that I was doing being increasingly kind of pulled into the orbit of gender identity. And I had a lot of questions and just spent several years just writing long Google documents with like all of my questions and all of the material that I could pull out. And to actually do a thesis, you really have to narrow down. And the question that I decided that I was maybe best equipped to address, and that was maybe the most neglected in the research, was around the role of online trans communities and how they shape the attitudes and beliefs and knowledge that young people have about gender, and how they shape intentions and expectations for transition or detransition. And so I focused on Reddit communities. I focused on females, members of these communities. One of the problems with other research, including the very limited research on internet communities, was that they wouldn't distinguish between, are the people involved male or female? And of course, there are a lot of reasons to think that males and females have very different paths into and out of trans identity. And what I study is, after spending a couple of years on these communities, it was like, I think that the most interesting place is to see how people are socialized into these communities, how they adopt the beliefs, how they come to certainty, or at least a strong feeling that they should transition, was to look at how questions and doubts are dealt with in the community. And the short answer to that is that questions and doubts come up all the time, but they almost never come up unpackaged. So they will be kind of wrapped up in this other language where you'll say like, I really feel like my internalized transphobia is coming out here because I feel really nervous about like the surgery that's coming up, or I have really mixed feelings about changing my legal documents, or I feel like I have like an imposter syndrome because I don't feel like a man, or I don't feel like I'm really trans and I might feel like I might be faking it. Or they'll talk about having turf thoughts or exposing themselves to digital self-harm by reading gender critical content online, and then that it triggers these feelings of doubt about what they're doing. And basically the effect of packaging your own questions and doubts in this way is that you say up front, like, this really isn't important, and like, I need the community to like help me put this down. And that's exactly what happens.
Yeah.
So that has been just the focus of my thesis, and we'll see if I haven't decided if I want to continue and do a PhD, but it would definitely be in the same vein.
You let me hook here. You had you did an unheard piece. It was with the title of Why should lesbians have sex with men? It's now bigoted to be attracted to female-only bodies. And in that article, you mentioned a survey that you did. Mm-hmm. Called Unspeakable LGBTQ, where you asked the question, what do you wish you could say about your experiences as a woman in the LGBTQ community? So could you talk about those surveys responses?
Sure. And I should make it clear, this was before I was a graduate student, so this wasn't academic research. This was just, I was working with two friends, one of whom had detransitioned and one had desisted. And we really just wanted to kind of create a space where women in the LGBT community could talk about, what was going on, how they were what they were experiencing. So we created that in the summer of 2021 and got hundreds and hundreds of responses. And they were really like, there were comparisons between participation in, LGBT communities now to like growing up in an oppressive religion like Mormonism. There were women who were talking about like being pushed back into the closet or being pressured to accept male sex partners or being constantly bothered about, pronouns and how they identify because they were gender nonconforming. They talked about older women would talk about like the loss of spaces. So like bookstores and bars and clubs where they would go to, and even, picnics and Mishfest and all of these events that had been such an important formative experience for them. And younger women would talk about how that these were almost like mythical spaces for them because they had never existed in the lives of younger women. And there were just a couple of quotes that I just wanted to mention from what women wrote in. One woman said, "We're allowed to have no leadership positions without the permission or surveillance of men, even in our own organizations. I was excited to join LGBT spaces and meet people like me, but it wasn't like that. I left one cult and I found that what awaited me was another. In LGBT and other progressive circles, women don't have the right to assemble without the presence of men, who by nature of being male have no ability to relate to the experiences of women. Just like my old religion, you aren't allowed to question the ideology. In this case, it's transgenderism, without being ostracized. And just like my old religion, men's feelings and sensibilities must be taken into account in everything that women do." And a couple of women wrote about having either desisted or detransitioned from trans identities. And, that they had, one woman said, she spent years running from being a butch lesbian, and that she said she had transitioned in order to escape the shame and the fear that she had. And she says, "When I finally came to terms with the fact that transition had not really helped, and I was still the same me I detransitioned, I wanted community more than anything then, but there isn't a place for me anymore. Before I transitioned, there were several lesbian groups in my area, but they don't exist anymore. As far as I can tell, there's no lesbian space or group anywhere in the city. I can't express how painful it is not to have a place to belong." And a young woman who desisted said that the problem with leaving the trans cult as a lesbian is that you can never really leave because the ideology is in every LGBT space, every LGBT charity. It's on every dating site. It's on the front page of every news site every day.
You attended to this recent WPATH conference, Undercover, you said.
Mhm.
So what was that about? Tell us about that.
Sure. So the World Professional Association for Transgender Health came to my city late last year. As you can imagine, it was pretty hard to resist going to see what was going on, as somebody who's been researching what they call gender affirming care for several years. And I would have to say it's very different to, I had read dozens and dozens of research articles and listened to interviews and taken hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes on this belief system that is infecting medical practice. And it is a completely different experience to actually go and be surrounded by people who are true believers or sure willing to act like it if they have maybe more opportunistic motives. And I think that it really is a mix between opportunists and between people who have an almost religious attachment to the ideology. This is something I've talked about a few places, and I've talked about kind of the wilder parts. Like there were sessions about people who claim to have multiple personalities and how you can transition a person who has too many personalities for the therapist to interview about their transition goals. And I've talked about the eunuch session before. So what I really wanted to just mention today was kind of the more mundane talks and how those were, in a way, even more disturbing, even though they were much less flashy. So there were a lot of sessions about issues like mental health assessment for adolescents with mental health comorbidities. And it was interesting because the conference had imposed the title that included assessment on the presenters, and the presenters were unable to speak about what they did without putting assessment in, these very ironic, heavy air quotes. And so they would talk about kids coming in and having autism, and everyone would say, well, you should like assess them and you should take more time. And they would talk about kids who had pretty serious comorbidities, even up to psychosis. And they would be like, hopefully, patients aren't actively psychotic. Ideally, patients aren't actively psychotic is what they said. But that, of course, a psychotic patient can consent to take high blood pressure medication or can consent to take stool softeners. So why would testosterone be any different? And they also, there was a session from the Dutch clinicians who were talking about some longitudinal research that I don't believe has been published yet, but they were presenting. And it was like, okay, for these patients who we transitioned as teenagers in the 2010s, and they're now in their 30s, have their gender identities changed over time? Has their sexual orientation changed over time? And how do they feel about questions of fertility? Because all of the kids who went on this protocol, they were puberty blocked, and then they were given cross-sex hormones. And so the effect is that they have been sterilized, that they cannot have biological children. And they're reporting these very concerning results that it was something like 40% felt like it was, it was problematic. Or I think the translation that they used was that it was troublesome, that they had lost their fertility. And there were participants who expressed that they just hadn't been old enough when they were 11 or 12, when they started down this path, to consent to give away their future in that way. And a few minutes later, the presenter will be, she'll be joking about how she really doesn't like to do prediction, and she can't predict how she'll feel in the future. And she says, I can predict how I'll feel, 5 minutes from now, which is, I'll still be nervous, and everybody laughs. And she's like, but I can't predict how I'll feel tomorrow. And so you have these people who have this tremendous responsibility as medical providers working with young people, and they are making jokes out of the impossibility of predicting their own desires tomorrow. And they're kind of hand waving this data that shows that there's a lot of regret about fertility. They packaged the data about kind of changes in gender identity in such a way that there were no numbers on detransition. So they talked about, they put all in one group, people who detransitioned and people who maybe identified as non-binary or an elf or a fairy or a friendly, non-threatening woman, like that these were all the same kind of thing, so that they couldn't say, oh, we had X patients detransition. And I think one of the other most interesting veins from WPATH was just the framing around embodiment goals kind of taking off over the framing around gender dysphoria. So
what do you mean by embodiment goals?
Yeah, what they mean by that is they want to shift the focus from the patient's distress and also from kind of the diagnosis of gender dysphoria to the patient's kind of objectives for how they would like to change their body. And the way that they would talk about it is like, embodiment goals, these are something that might shift over time, but also like it's imperative that you help a patient realize whatever their embodiment goals are right now. And so there was a presenter who was talking about, maybe a patient wants more boobs or less boobs or no boobs, or maybe if they want them later, they could get them again. There was just this incredible casualness to the way that they were talking about kind of customizing the human body. And you could see this, like the justification of medical diagnosis and distress kind of falling away in favor of what I would describe as a much more transhuman framing of like, how can we think about the human body in terms of what enhancement technologies can provide? Yeah. And how can we conceptualize the human body in its natural, intact state as being this disease state that doctors have a responsibility to modify according to the patient's whims, with the acknowledgement that these can be whims, that they can be shifting. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't make a permanent intervention.
So you've written about the dangers of just a few articles about the dangers of gender affirming care. Well, after going to the WPATH conference, are there just some few little statements you could say about it, or is it just feels like there's too many questions and that you're still kind of battling with on all of this? Or some impressions, maybe that would be the word.
I would say the way that I've been able to make sense of gender affirming care and how affirmative clinicians understand what they're doing is that affirmative clinicians feel an intense loyalty to a patient's kind of transgender alter. And that this is not the same thing as feeling an intense loyalty for like the actually existing physical patient who's sitting in front of them. And it can really be the opposite. That this belief in the transgender alter, it's a belief that allows a doctor to do basically unlimited harm to a patient in the belief that they're doing good. And that the way that affirmative care works is that you basically, a clinician will lose sight of who the patient is almost immediately, because once trans comes up, once a kid says I'm trans, it's like nothing else matters. Not if they have other mental health comorbidities, it doesn't matter what's in their biography, if they have a history of sexual trauma or bullying. It doesn't matter if they're probably just gay. And it doesn't matter what age or stage they're at. And so as soon as a kid comes out as trans, the doctor will lose sight of sex. They'll call girls boys. They're still girls. They will conceptualize a patient as wrongly sexed as being in need of reconstructive relief. And that's a much easier sell for doctors to see that as within their brief than if they were to acknowledge it as like an extreme cosmetic or body modification intervention. If you listen to a lot of affirmative clinicians, you will notice that they really, really love to talk about people, no matter the age of the people, that the patients that they're talking about. So Joanna Allison Kennedy will mention something about a 3-year-old and kind of a 3-year-old's gender expression. And a couple of sentences later, she will say, people know who they are. Because if she said toddlers know who they are, everybody would say they're toddlers. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that I think that there's this heavy reliance on bad analogies within gender affirming care that also really kind of lubricate the path for gender affirming clinicians to not see what they're doing. And so they will constantly compare gender affirming care to insulin, providing insulin to a diabetic. Of course, diabetes is an objective physical condition that you can measure, and you can measure how well the treatment is working. And it's actually life-threatening if it's not treated. And they will also compare, especially when they're talking about kids and issues like the unknowns of puberty blockers and their effects on brain development and their effects on fertility, they will compare these patients to patients with cancer, except of course, these kids don't have cancer.